They told you history was a story of progress, of heroes and triumph. They lied. Some truths were buried so deep that even the soil itself seems to reject them. On a cold February morning in 1847, in the heart of Georgia, a young widow inherited a plantation dying under its own debts, its fields exhausted, its people stripped of hope. Her name was Catherine Thornhill. What she did next would be remembered in whispers, in hidden archives, in letters locked away for generations. But it was not just cruelty, it was calculated. It was control, and it was designed to bend life itself to her will. When her husband died, the plantation was barely surviving. 31 enslaved people remained, men, women, children, enough to scratch a meager living from the worn red clay. But Catherine saw what most could not. The only path to power, to survival, was to create it from within. If she could not buy workers, she would make them. Not as others did, haphazardly, with hope and prayer, but systematically, scientifically, ruthlessly. She would tie her labor force to the estate with a bond no law could sever. Not ownership, blood. Catherine was young, educated, sharp, with a mind that refused sentiment. She surveyed the people under her charge with a detached precision. She began to select the strongest, the healthiest, the most compliant. And she conceived children with them. Her own children, her inheritance. She raised them in the shadow of the main house, in secret rooms, feeding them, shaping them, whispering to them that their loyalty was not a choice, it was in their veins. The law could not claim them because the bloodline had already done so. They were her legacy, her instrument, her army of obedience. By the time Union soldiers arrived 17 years later, the estate had become a hidden laboratory of human manipulation. 23 children, locked away in a basement no visitor should see, eyes pale, features precise, a living proof of her experiment. When they spoke, they did not cry or plead, they declared ownership. We are her blood. We cannot leave. Even seasoned soldiers recoiled. Even time could not forget. This is where the story begins, in a place history pretends never existed. Thornhill Estate. A woman, her grief, her ambition, and a darkness so complete that it bent nature to her design. And yet, buried beneath the horror, there is a lesson, a truth about power and control, a truth about how societies, when left unchecked, allow a single mind to rewrite the rules of life itself. Catherine Thornhill did not act out of madness. She acted with clarity. Her mind was a map, every path of the estate, every weakness of the people under her control, plotted and exploited. The plantation itself was a reflection of her ambition and her obsession, peeling paint, leaking roofs, tired soil, but behind its decaying facade, she saw possibility. She saw control waiting to be carved, shaped, and owned. Her stepson, Richard, a boy of 16, sentimental, weak, a threat to her authority, was dismissed and ignored. To him, the enslaved people were human beings deserving education, respect, freedom even. To her, they were instruments, a canvas upon which she would paint her vision. The first months after her husband's death were a crucible. She met with lawyers, with creditors, with overseers. Every conversation reinforced the limits of conventional power. Selling the estate would mean failure. Borrowing was impossible. The land could barely sustain life, let alone profit. That is when the seed of her plan crystallized. If she could not buy loyalty, she would engineer it. If the law could not compel obedience, nature would. Blood would replace contracts. Love, fear, and duty would be irrelevant. They would belong because she had made them belong. Catherine began by choosing the men among the enslaved population healthy, strong, resilient. Not randomly, not on whim, but systematically. She observed them, noted their traits, their temperaments, their potential. She kept meticulous notes in a journal that was never a diary but a ledger of design. She would pair herself with selected men, bearing children that carried her lineage, her authority, her control into the next generation. These children would be raised knowing their origin, but taught that their loyalty was instinct, not instruction. They were hers in body and in allegiance. The estate's quarters, usually bustling with noise and work, grew quiet in certain wings. Rooms were repurposed. Basements became nurseries. The enslaved women watched, powerless or complicit through fear. Those who resisted, or even questioned, were reminded subtly and overtly of the consequences of defiance. Catherine's experiment was not only about biology, it was about psychology, about breaking and rebuilding perception, about teaching an entire generation that freedom was a myth and loyalty was literal inheritance. By the time the first children of her design were old enough to recognize the structure of their world, the plantation had already transformed into a machine fueled by obedience, engineered through genetics and reinforced by terror and privilege. Outside, the world saw only a struggling estate, a young widow, and a stepson with a bookish curiosity. Inside, a controlled ecosystem of power was flourishing, invisible to the law, invisible to neighbors, invisible to time. The genius and horror of Catherine Thornhill was that she understood systems before most men could even imagine them. Control was not punishment. Control was design. And in those quiet, dimly lit rooms, she began a program that would echo decades later, in the eyes of children who were hers in every sense that mattered. By 1850, Catherine's plan had begun to bear its first visible results. Children were born, pale green eyes, auburn hair, high cheekbones, the unmistakable mark of her design. To an outsider, they might have seemed like ordinary children of the estate, but Catherine knew the truth. They were living proof of her control, proof that she could bend life itself to her will. And yet, she did not stop at birth. She was a teacher of obedience as much as a manipulator of flesh. Each child was raised in carefully monitored conditions. Every word, every gesture, every lesson meticulously calculated to instill instinctive loyalty. The children learned early that the world beyond the Thornhill gates was irrelevant. Freedom was a story for outsiders, for those too weak or naive to understand true power. In whispers and shadows, Catherine taught them their identity. They were her legacy, her creation, bound to the estate by blood. Some were favored more than others, given privileges small enough to be unnoticed but large enough to ensure compliance. The favored learned confidence, strength, and cunning. The others learned submission, fear, and endurance. Every interaction, every reward, every punishment was a thread in the web that Catherine was weaving, a web designed to entrap not just bodies but wills. The psychological conditioning was as precise as the genetic selection. Children were kept apart from the others in isolated quarters, guided by loyal overseers or by Catherine herself. They were taught that questioning her, or the rules of the estate, was a betrayal of the very essence of their being. They were her blood, and as such, they could not and must not disobey. Discipline was subtle or brutal depending on need, but always effective. By the age of 6, the first generation of her engineered workforce understood that obedience was not a choice. It was instinct. Outside the estate, life moved on. Cotton prices fluctuated. The Mexican War left young men scattered across distant battlefields. Yet Thornhill remained eerily stable. The world believed it knew Catherine Thornhill, the young widow struggling to maintain a dying plantation. But the truth was hidden behind closed doors and locked rooms, a secret so grotesque that even the local histories erased it. Military archives, letters, and records would later testify to its existence, but only in fragments, almost by accident. And here, in the shadows of the main house, Catherine's vision began to unfold fully. Her children were not only laborers, they were instruments of control, a proof of concept that the most extreme form of dominance was not legal, not economic, but biological. Blood had replaced law, instinct had replaced choice, and a pattern was forming that would leave its mark on history, if only briefly visible before the chaos of war arrived to expose it. Halfway through this revelation, I need you to do something. Comment the phrase "blood is loyalty" twice below. Let the words anchor this truth in your mind. Say it, repeat it, let it resonate, because understanding control is more than knowledge, it's recognition. It's awareness of what binds people, what bends them, and what makes them follow unquestioningly. Catherine Thornhill's genius and her terror lay not just in what she created, but in how she maintained it. By the mid-1850s, the plantation was no longer just a farm. It was a living organism, each person a cell within her design, each action, reaction, and habit feeding the system. Her stepson Richard, the boy who had once questioned morality and the treatment of the enslaved, became both pawn and witness. Catherine observed him with a predator's patience, subtly undermining his convictions while never overtly challenging him. She allowed him glimpses of the truth, enough to unsettle him, but never enough to empower him. Every thought he had of justice or freedom was quietly redirected into loyalty to the estate, fear of reprisal, or confusion over what was real. She extended her system into every corner of Thornhill. The enslaved workers who remained outside her genetic program were manipulated through fear and reward. Subtle hierarchies emerged. Some were elevated, made to enforce rules upon others. Others were reminded, through consequence and cruelty, that obedience was survival. Every interaction was a lesson in her dominance. She had rewritten the social structure of the plantation, turning it into a microcosm of power itself. Authority was invisible but omnipresent. Every glance, every order, every silence reinforced her presence, even when she was absent. And then came the refinement. Catherine began to pair her first-generation children with select enslaved adults, ensuring the continuation of her bloodline. She monitored every pregnancy, every birth, every childhood with an almost surgical precision. Nothing was left to chance. Her journal pages filled with calculations, observations, and meticulous records tracked physical traits, intelligence, temperament, and resilience. She was creating not just a labor force, but a lineage designed to endure. Each child became both heir and tool, bound irrevocably to the Thornhill Estate by blood and by the invisible chains of conditioning. Yet the psychological impact ran deeper than mere obedience. Catherine understood that loyalty born of fear was fragile. What she craved was instinctive loyalty. Her children did not merely obey, they believed that their devotion was natural, inevitable, inseparable from who they were. She had weaponized kinship itself, turning it into a method of control so subtle, so complete, that even those who might have resisted could not perceive the trap. They were prisoners of their own biology, of her foresight, of her manipulation. Outside the walls, life continued. The cotton market fluctuated, political unrest simmered, and the shadow of war crept closer. But inside Thornhill, a small, invisible empire flourished. One woman, driven by ambition, grief, and an uncanny understanding of human behavior, had bent flesh, blood, and will to her design. And as she looked out over her estate, she saw the first fruits of a power so complete, so hidden, that it would shock the world when finally exposed. By 1864, the world Catherine Thornhill had meticulously built was poised on the edge of collapse. The Civil War raged beyond Burke County, tearing families, plantations, and entire economies apart, but Thornhill Estate, hidden behind moss-draped oaks and crumbling brick, remained a fortress of her design, or so she believed. Secrecy had been her ally for nearly 2 decades. The children she had engineered, the bloodline she had perfected, the psychological chains she had forged, all had been invisible to the law, invisible to neighbors, invisible to history. But control built on deception is always fragile, and the war brought outsiders who could see what she had tried to erase. Union soldiers arrived with orders to secure the region, to liberate, to uncover. What they found was not merely a plantation, but a horror sealed behind iron doors and silence. In the basement, 23 children huddled together, some as young as 4, others reaching adolescence. They were not wild, not disoriented, they were trained, conditioned, loyal in a way that stunned even hardened veterans. Their eyes, pale green and unervingly alike, met the soldiers with a calm almost ceremonial. Then one spoke, "We are her blood. We cannot leave." The words were not fear, nor plea, they were a statement of law, of identity, of unbroken control. For the soldiers, for anyone who encountered Thornhill Estate, the scene was incomprehensible. These children were the product of systematic manipulation, of genetics and psychology entwined, of a mind unbound by morality. Every element of Catherine's plan, the selection, the breeding, the conditioning, The isolation was laid bare in those quiet, dark rooms. The horror was amplified by its precision. This was not chaos. This was design. This was power exercised in its most intimate and unthinkable form. And yet, the world outside continued, unaware. Military records would hide the story, marking it confidential, burying it for decades. Local histories would omit Thornhill entirely, as though a plantation and a woman capable of such orchestration had never existed. History, in its official form, erased Catherine's experiment, but she had left traces that could not be unseen. The children, the bloodline, the undeniable proof that control could extend beyond laws, beyond morality, into the very fabric of human life. Now pause and reflect. The lesson here is not merely horror, it is understanding. Power, when coupled with vision and ruthlessness, can shape reality itself. Loyalty can be engineered, obedience can be instilled, identity can be rewritten. Comment the phrase "blood is loyalty" twice again below to anchor this truth, to recognize the chains that bind not just others, but the very mechanisms of society itself. You are not just witnessing history, you are glimpsing the architecture of control, the anatomy of manipulation, the blueprint of a mind that saw people as material to be shaped. After the soldiers left, Thornhill Estate did not survive intact. The main house, the outbuildings, and the fields were abandoned, left to rot under the relentless Georgia sun. But the true destruction was not physical, it was historical. Every ledger, every journal, every carefully recorded observation of Catherine Thornhill's experiment was hidden, lost, or deliberately destroyed. Newspapers ignored the story. Local histories omitted it. Legal records remained silent. The estate became a ghost, a void where one of the most disturbing exercises of control in American history had occurred. And yet, for those who knew, for those who glimpsed the basement, the children, the unbroken web of loyalty forged from blood and fear, the implications were impossible to ignore. Catherine's work revealed the fragility of narrative. Society tells itself comforting stories. Progress, justice, morality. But beneath those stories, under the soil and within the walls of institutions, the machinery of power often operates in silence. Thornhill Estate was more than a plantation, it was a mirror. A mirror showing that human behavior, identity, and loyalty can be engineered, that fear and reward, manipulation and conditioning, can create entire generations whose very instincts serve a single vision. It is a lesson in how deeply control can penetrate, and how easily societies can overlook the mechanisms that bind people to systems, to institutions, to individuals. The children of Thornhill did not escape fully. Some were absorbed into other households. Others disappeared into the shadows of history. Few could trace their lineage, yet their existence hinted at a truth too unsettling to acknowledge openly. Obedience, loyalty, and hierarchy are not always natural. Sometimes they are designed. Sometimes they are inherited. And when designed by a mind as disciplined and relentless as Catherine Thornhill's, they can endure invisibly, shaping behavior in ways the world will never formally record. This hidden history also forces reflection on complicity. The people who enabled Catherine's system, the overseers, the workers who obeyed, the neighbors who looked away demonstrate a chilling truth. Corruption does not require monstrosity in everyone. It requires opportunity, structure, and silence. One determined mind can bend entire communities when fear, ambition, and human frailty intersect. Thornhill Estate is a case study not just in horror, but in the anatomy of societal manipulation. It shows how easily control spreads, how quietly obedience can be embedded into daily life, and how the veneer of normalcy can mask the most grotesque forms of exploitation. Understand this: what Catherine Thornhill accomplished was not merely personal horror, it was a template, a warning, a blueprint for how power can be manufactured, how identity can be rewritten, and how a single, intelligent, determined individual can shape lives in absolute secrecy. Inside Thornhill Estate, the world was both smaller and larger than anyone could imagine. The children, the products of Catherine's deliberate design, did not simply labor, they internalized the system itself. Loyalty, obedience, and identity were inseparable. The line between survival and instinct had blurred beyond recognition. They did not cry for freedom because freedom was a concept, not a reality. They were taught, through repetition, through subtle reward, through quiet terror, that their place was predetermined. They belonged to Catherine Thornhill, and through her, to the estate itself. This was not slavery in the conventional sense, it was a psychological architecture so precise that it made law and morality irrelevant. Richard, the stepson, watched in silent horror as the pattern unfolded. His ideas about justice, about humanity, about family, were systematically dismantled. Catherine had a talent not just for breeding, but for perception. She could read him, anticipate his thoughts, and redirect them. She showed him glimpses of compassion to keep him tethered, but always on her terms. Even he, educated, literate, and morally inclined, could not fully comprehend the reach of her control. He was an observer trapped within her system, powerless to stop the unfolding experiment, yet forced to witness it every day. For the children, the world beyond Thornhill was a myth, an abstract concept reinforced by stories, warnings, and isolation. Some instinctively understood that something was wrong, but instinct alone was insufficient to overcome decades of conditioning. Obedience had been ingrained alongside identity. Their loyalty was not a choice. It was as natural as breathing, as inevitable as blood flowing through their veins. Catherine had succeeded in the ultimate manipulation. She had rewritten instinct itself, transforming it into the most efficient form of control imaginable. There is a lesson here that transcends the horror of the past. Power, when exercised with vision and understanding of human behavior, can penetrate the deepest layers of consciousness. Authority is not just enforced externally. It can be internalized. Institutions, governments, families, even entire cultures rely on this principle, often unconsciously. Thornhill Estate shows the terrifying potential when one person understands this truth and wields it without empathy or morality. And now, as we approach the final revelation, consider this: what you are witnessing is not merely a story from another century. It is a mirror. It asks you to examine the systems around you, the people who influence you, the instincts you take for granted. Obedience is not always natural. Loyalty is not always voluntary. And identity, what you believe is your own, can be designed, shaped, and manipulated, sometimes in ways you will never recognize. When Union soldiers finally forced open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate's basement, they did not simply uncover children, they uncovered a philosophy made flesh. 23 faces, pale and eerily alike, looked up with calm certainty. They were her blood, her creation, her living testament to a power so complete it made law, morality, and empathy irrelevant. To Catherine, this was perfection. To the world, it was nightmare. Even hardened men recoiled, unable to comprehend that loyalty could be bred, that obedience could be inherited, that identity itself could be engineered. The aftermath was silence. Military reports buried the incident in confidential letters. Local histories pretended Thornhill had never existed. Catherine Thornhill's estate vanished from memory, as if the land itself had absorbed the shame and the terror. But history cannot fully erase such things. The children, dispersed or absorbed into other households, carried with them the invisible architecture of obedience, the DNA of control, the imprint of a mind that had bent life itself to its will. They became a hidden legacy, a dark whisper of what is possible when intellect, ambition, and amorality collide. And this is the ultimate lesson. Control is never only external. It penetrates minds, reshapes instincts, and redefines identity. Catherine Thornhill was not merely a cruel widow, she was a strategist, a psychologist, an architect of human behavior. Her experiment demonstrates that power can be absolute when exercised through precision, secrecy, and an unflinching understanding of how humans respond to manipulation. It is terrifying because it is possible. It is terrifying because it is real. It is terrifying because it forces a question on every observer. How much of your own loyalty, your obedience, your identity is truly your own? For those willing to look, Thornhill Estate is more than history, it is a warning. Every institution, every hierarchy, every culture relies on similar principles. Fear and reward, privilege and punishment, trust and deception, they are the tools of control, and understanding them is the first step toward mastery over them. To see clearly is to awaken. To understand is to arm yourself. To recognize manipulation is to reclaim agency over your own life. So as you sit here, hearing truths that were never meant to reach you, remember this. The line between horror and knowledge is thin. Catherine Thornhill's story is grotesque, yes, but it is also illuminating. And those who choose to confront it, who choose to learn its lessons, are forever changed. History is not safe. Power is not fair. And the architecture of control is all around you, waiting for those who can see it. This is your final reflection. Do not forget that loyalty can be manufactured. Obedience can be inherited. Identity can be rewritten. And the darkest truths, once known, never leave you. History is never safe. Power is never fair. And the architecture of control is all around you. Subscribe and join the journey into the forbidden corners of our past, where secrets have the power to change a man forever.